On the Subway by Sharon Olds. The boy and I face each other. His feet are huge, in black sneakers laced with white, in a complex pattern like a set of intentional scars. We are stuck on opposite sides of the car, a couple of molecules stuck in a rod of light, rapidly moving through darkness. He has the casual, cold look of a mugger, alert under hooded lids. He is wearing red, like the inside of a body exposed. I am wearing dark fur, the whole skin of an animal taken and used. I look at his raw face. He looks at my fur coat, and I don't know if I am in his power. He could take my coat so easily, my briefcase, my life. Or if he is in my power, the way I am living off his life, eating the steak he does not eat, as if I am taking the food from his mouth. And he is black, and I am white. And without meaning or trying to, I must profit from his darkness, the way he absorbs the murderous beams of the nation's head, as black cotton absorbs the heat of the sun and holds it. There is no way to know how easy this white skin makes my life. This life he could take so easily and break across his knee like a stick, the way his own back is being broken. The rod of his soul that at birth was dark and fluid, rich as the head of a seedling, ready to thrust up into any available light.
Hi, welcome to Litpoetry and our exploration of the poem On the Subway by Sharon Olds. In the American poetry scene, Sharon Olds is one of the leading voices in contemporary poetry. Olds is known for writing deeply personal and emotionally fierce poetry which explicitly explores family life as well as global political themes and issues. In the Voice Literary Supplement, David Levitt said of Olds that she is enormously self-aware and that her poetry is remarkable for its candor, its eroticism and its power to move. Olds' candor and skill as a poet has been widely praised, with another literary critic saying, "By far the greater number of her poems are believable and touching, and their intensity does not interfere with craftsmanship. Listening to Olds, we hear a proud, urgent, human voice." Notably, Olds is the winner of several celebrated literary awards, including the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Critics Circle Award. Overall, Olds' poetry is recognised for its straightforward, no-nonsense free verse style, which in many cases adopts a first-person narrative style as well, where the poet injects herself directly into her poems in order to humanise them. Her poetic approach is known for both its exactitude and its versatility, experimenting with many different styles. The vibrant events detailed in her poems are always drawn with poignant images that transition abruptly from the disturbing to the beautiful and back again. Her work has drawn a wide following, with her award-winning volume The Dead and the Living from 1984 selling over 50,000 copies, which is a remarkable achievement for a work of poetry in the USA. Olds was born in San Francisco in 1942, growing up in Berkeley, California, and attending Stanford University. She went on to gain her PhD at Columbia in 1972. At the age of 37, she published her first book of poems, Satan Says. That was in 1980. And 4 decades later, she remains a unique voice in contemporary American poetry. On the Subway was first published in The Gold Cell, 1987. And the poem's subject matter it tackles the issues of white privilege and systemic racism in the United States. And these are issues that are as relevant now as they were when they were written over 3 decades ago. Form and structure. Written in a free verse form of a poetic monologue, the overall structure of Olds' On the Subway is rather linear, stretching down the page in a free-flowing, almost stream of conscious-like manner. The poem takes you, the reader, in a journey through the narrator's thoughts, fears and revelations as she reflects on her place in the world relative to a young African-American man sitting opposite her. In many ways, its linear structure and direction of the poem is like a set of train tracks that guide the reader down the page towards a final destination that offers a profound insight into the systemic injustice in American society. As a kind of a track, it is interesting to note that as we go on this journey down the poem, that we are privy to the stop-start ponderings of the narrator's mind, moving forward with a question here while stopping at the occasional realization there. Through this intimate monologue, we get a real insight into the narrator's jumbled thoughts, which are quite literally stopping all stations along the journey. We're jolted this way and that as her mind click-clacks its way through a series of dark tunnels and thoughts, occasionally stopping at moments where the lights come on. At these moments, it's as if the bright platform lights are breaking through the windows of the carriage and giving us, the passengers, a moment of profound revelation. The last thing to note about the track-like structure of the poem is that it seems to travel through 3 distinct stations or states of being. In the first part of the poem, we're privy to the narrator's psychological and emotional state of fear, uncertainty and apprehension. The state of her mind in this section of the track she is on is stuck. It is stuck within the boundaries of society's conventional thinking with regards to race. Her mind is imprisoned by the cliche stereotypes she has probably grown up with that place people in different, categories according to their colour. We become aware here of how her social programming has predisposed her to label and judge the boy opposite her as a mugger and a criminal. In the second section of the poem, however, this emotional and irrational fear eventually gives way to the narrator's capacity to think, probe, and analyse the situation in a more honest and self-critical way. This section starts to explore the theme of power in a significant way and could be safely labelled as the philosophical section of the poem, where the work of critical thinking slowly begins to stamp out the emotional prejudices the narrator holds, prejudices that have so insidiously colonised her perceptions about others. And finally, the last section of the poem is one that's focused on revelation. This final section returns the narrator back to an emotional state, but this time it's an emotional state laced with hope, not fear. The narrator's last stop on her train journey in this way is a deeply internal one, where she experiences a profound epiphany about how society works. Moreover, she arrives at this new internal destination with a more fully integrated sense of herself and her place in the world. Within this new understanding about the world, she starts to see how the polarized categories that divide people into light and dark, good and bad categories and opposites they're just false fabrications that need to be challenged.
The boy and I face each other. His feet are huge, in black sneakers, laced with white, in a complex pattern like a set of intentional scars. We are stuck on opposite sides of the car, a couple of molecules stuck in a rod of light, rapidly moving through darkness.
In her poem, Olds asks the reader to enter the mind of a white woman who observes a young black man as they travel together, neither knowing the other. The word boy is noteworthy here, as the word itself has a long and negatively connotated history in the USA, often being used as a condescending way for a white person to address a fully developed black African American man. It is a very demeaning label. Of course, in the detailed description of the male's physical strength, it can be safely assumed that he is in fact not a boy, but rather he is probably a teenager or a youth. Therefore, while the narrator does not necessarily use the term boy here in a consciously racist way, its inclusion in the poem illustrates how the narrator's mind has already been partly colonized by the culture of which she is part of. As such, she has absorbed many attitudes of the past without realizing it, even though she might rightfully be fairly moral as a person in herself. This first section is deeply psychological and reveals the narrator's secret fears, going on to shine a light on the systemic racism that lies secreted at the heart of the American society and continues to divide its people even to today. The opening lines begin by highlighting this divide in society by drawing attention to opposites. And of course, these opposites continue throughout the poem. In this section, we have the boy and I, who are on opposite sides of the car, which reminds us of the old saying, opposite sides of the tracks. We also have the introduction in this section of opposites in the form of light and dark imagery in Rod of Light and Moving Through Darkness, as well as in black sneakers with white laces. Here the poet is highlighting the arbitrary divisions in society that associate darkness with negativity, negatives like fear, evil, danger and criminality, and light with ideas such as progress, wealth and goodness. Indeed, the poem starts to explore the problems with this type of simplistic and polarized way of understanding our world, and this will become more apparent later in the poem. Another point of note in this opening section are the negative connotations in the words huge and sneakers. The word huge instantly implies the youth as being possibly dangerous, and the word sneakers hints at secrecy and underhandedness. Of course, this gives us the reader an unfiltered glimpse into the narrator's worldview, and we can tell that she is subconsciously influenced by racial stereotypes. If we then apply a critical theory lens to our reading and view the unfolding events through, say, a Marxist interpretation framework, other avenues of analysis become open to us. According to Marxist theory, the ruling or privileged classes use a framework of ideologies to support the status quo and justify their power. In this case, the ideology of black being associated with evil and white with goodness helps to prop up systemic injustice and will continue to do so until those false ideologies are challenged and changed. This is partly what the poem aims to do. But in this first section, we get to witness just how subtly embedded into everyday life these ideologies actually are, and just how difficult it is to undertake the reflective work required to dismantle them. In this first section, notice too the clever use of the simile comparing the sneakers' white laces to a set of intentional scars. The scars instantly allude historically to the ridges of white scarring left after a black slave is punished and whipped. The laces also point to just how entangled the lives of black and whites actually are, but that is ultimately white people pulling the strings or tightening the nooses. The whites are generally in control in American society, while African Americans and other people of colour remain partially in bondage within an economic system that sells them the illusion of the American dream. It is a very clever simile. And when I personally picture these sneakers, I can't help but think of a pair of Nikes, a brand that so captivated the hopes and dreams of the African American people, while ironically being run by an unscrupulous company that has dabbled in child labour and economic slavery throughout the developing parts of the world. Finally, Within this first section is the use of the word stuck, which adds a hint of fatalism early on in this poem. Using Marxist analysis again, the word stuck implies entrenched social classes where the lower classes are perpetually oppressed. As for the term the rod of light, perhaps Olds is here making an association to the idea of modern society and the progress scientific advances have brought with them. Here, however, notice the irony of the phrase. For while the modern world has progressed technologically with its scientific manipulation of molecules, moral progress is lagging behind as society continues to move through darkness.
He has the casual, cold look of a mugger, alert under hooded lids. He is wearing red, like the inside of a body exposed. I am wearing dark fur, the whole skin of an animal taken and used. I look at his raw face. He looks at my fur coat.
One of the most important poetic techniques used by Olds in the poem is already evident after reading these early sections and continues on through the rest of the poem as well. One of these techniques is enjambment. Enjambment is where the poet regularly prevents the poem from pausing at the end of the lines and instead allows those lines to naturally flow on to the next line without stopping. This constant irregular continuation across lines of poetry creates a cascading effect that helps to mimic the patterns of digressions that the narrator's stream of consciousness is taking. The irregular pauses that do exist at times in the poem, however, generally happen within those lines of poetry and represent the other important poetic technique at play throughout the poem, caesura. The caesura include all the full stops, the commas and dashes that are used before the end of each line. Combined, the enjambment and caesura perfectly create a sense of turbulent thoughts spiraling through the narrator's mind. In this second section of the poem, the narrator's fear becomes palpable as she describes the young man as having the casual cold look of a mugger, a stereotypical association often placed unfairly on young black African American men. She immediately considers herself vulnerable and in danger, but this is also where the poem gets very interesting and we start to see a shift. This shift happens as the narrator slowly starts to look beyond her fears. The mugger's hoodie is described as being red, like the inside of a body exposed, while the observer is wearing dark fur, the whole skin of an animal taken and used. By creating a kind of hunting analogy, this ambivalent description starts to put questions into the reader's mind as to which one, the writer or the young man, is in fact the hunter and predator, and which one is the quarry or prey. While the youth initially appears dangerous, it is almost as if the observer has stolen the black man's skin and used it for her own protection. In other words, she appears in control. She is the hunter, and she is doubly protected against America's racist heart, while the black man has no protection and is exposed. She has literally stolen his skin and is wearing it, having skinned him alive. This theme of theft seemed ironic considering that the black man is first described as a mugger. Indeed, the description of the youth's raw face really starts to change the reader's perception as we start to see him as the prey in this scene and as a victim of systemic injustice. His being alert now seems more a description of his own insecurity than a description of his potential malice.
And I don't know if I am in his power. He could take my coat so easily, my briefcase, my life. Or if he is in my power, the way I am living off his life, eating the steak he does not eat, as if I am taking the food from his mouth.
In this third section, the narrator sheds her fears as she moves into a more philosophical place, full of probing self-reflection and social analysis, particularly around the notion of power. This third segment asks whether the observer is in the black man's power or whether it's the other way around. we begin to see a difference between the choices of the individual and society here in this questioning. The observer's fear of the black man is a personal description. She is afraid the black man might mug her. However, the observer's sense of power over the black man describes not the individual difference between them, but how they are placed, within the society. The group in society that the white woman belongs to is feeding off the group that the black man belongs to, eating the steak he does not eat. Steak, of course, being a symbol of wealth, but also connecting back to the earlier analogy of hunting. Since her actual power is derived from her social position rather than from her individual physical strength, there is nothing she can do to change this imbalance, essentially or especially if she remains within the bounds of society as it currently exists. It is interesting to note that the theme of theft now ties in with the theme of society. As an individual, the black man is the one who people might wrongly think is likely to steal from the white woman. However, as a society, white people are stealing from black people constantly, stealing their hopes for the future, for example. In this section, therefore, Olds imagines or manages in some ways to flip our understanding of what criminality actually looks like, and it's quite a remarkable feat.
And he is black, and I am white. And without meaning or trying to, I must profit from his darkness. The way he absorbs the murderous beams of the nation's head, as black cotton absorbs the heat of the sun and holds it.
Change is difficult because injustice underpins the systems of this world. And this fourth section highlights this. Even with good intentions and a truthful realisation as her guide, the narrator sees how her agency to change the reality around her is actually limited. She must profit from the situation as it stands. There is no easy cliche solution to the problem, even though her epiphany about the world around her is a healthy first step. Note here in this section also how the poet continues to reverse and confuse notions of light and dark, moving them beyond their normal stereotypical tropes. The beams of light that should be coming from those in power in the nation's head, for instance, and give guidance to others and give clarity, are murderous. And here we also have the beautiful but disturbing simile of how the youth is absorbing society's hatred as black cotton and holding it. Clearly, the reference to cotton here has a strong association to the history of black slavery in America, and implies that the history of slavery is still playing out today.
There is no way to know how easy this white skin makes my life. This life he could take so easily and break across his knee like a stick, the way his own back is being broken. The rod of his soul that at birth was dark and fluid, rich as the head of a seedling, ready to thrust up into any available light.
This final section brings the poem full circle to the point of revelation and hope. The rod of light described earlier in the poem returns now to be found as a description of the youth's soul. His inherent black beauty is displayed in his potential to thrust up towards the light. This final section is arresting in its vivid imagery and its ability to describe darkness now in a positive way, as being both fluid and rich. It is interesting to remember that historically, throughout the height of slavery in the USA in the early to mid 19th century, there existed an underground railway of secret routes and safety houses used by enslaved African Americans to escape into the free northern states and Canada. The scheme was assisted by abolitionists and others sympathetic to the cause of the escapees. On the Subway makes a connection back to these events, but in many ways it reverses the role of the slaves within this more contemporary context. It is the white privileged woman who is the slave in this context, as she is a prisoner in her own mind, trapped in a world of ideologies, prejudices, stereotypes and affluences that insulate her from the injustices of a system from which she must profit. In our reading of this poem, the narrator could be interpreted as once again travelling along the Underground Railway of liberation, more than a century later, but this time to emancipate herself from a very different kind of shackle. In her journey on this contemporary Underground Railway, or subway, she comes to realise that it is not enough to think that it is just up to black African Americans to empower and liberate themselves, because the reality is that the system itself is inherently too unjust and broken to be conquered by their efforts alone. The idea of the American dream is exposed for the unfair myth that it is, and therefore black empowerment is only part of the solution. In addition, the narrator sees that the answer to black African American liberation also involves those in possession of power and privilege in society, like herself, being willing to surrender some of their great wealth in order that others may grow and flourish. Thank you.